A Ukrainian drone operator retrained on a new airframe in 2 weeks. A Russian electronic warfare unit jammed an entire GPS corridor and forced an artillery battery to switch targeting methods on the fly. A fiber optic guided drone appeared near Kharkiv in late February of 2025, the first time that specific technology had appeared in combat. The weapon was redesigned, built, tested, and deployed faster than the European Union's existing defense funding programs could have issued a grant application. That gap between the speed of modern warfare and the speed of European procurement is exactly what Brussels tried to close in March of 2026. On March 24th of that year, the European Commission proposed a new instrument called the Programme for Agile and Rapid Defense Innovation, referred to as Agile, 115 million euros targeted at disruptive defense technologies, artificial intelligence, quantum systems, drones. The proposal came with an explicit timeline guarantee that has no precedent in the European Union's defense funding history. Companies would receive funding decisions within 4 months of application, and the technologies funded would reach European defense forces within 1 to 3 years of the contract's start date. For anyone who has watched European defense procurement move at the pace of a decades-long design competition, those timelines sound almost impossible. They are the point. Like and subscribe. Because to understand why the EU just placed quantum technology in the same category as drone swarms and artificial intelligence in a defense program explicitly designed to mimic the speed of a battlefield, you need to understand what battlefields in 2025 and 2026 have actually been teaching every defense ministry watching them. The war in Ukraine began as a conventional conflict between two armies with recognizable weapons, tanks, artillery, air power, and infantry. By the time 2025 arrived, it had transformed into something that military theorists are still struggling to categorize. Ukraine's drone production scaled from hundreds of systems per month to hundreds of thousands. The innovation cycle for a new first-person view drone design, from concept to deployment, had compressed to days in some cases. Operators who discovered a countermeasure to their current airframe on Monday were flying a redesigned version that defeated that countermeasure by Friday. Russia responded with its own technological acceleration. Shahid drones were modified to carry cluster munitions. Electronic warfare systems were deployed at density levels that degraded GPS reception across entire operational corridors. Fiber optic guided drones, which cannot be jammed because their guidance signal travels through a physical cable rather than a radio link, appeared in combat zones for the first time. At one point in early 2026, Russia was simultaneously running decoy drone swarms, conventional cruise missile salvos, and targeted electronic warfare suppression in coordinated waves timed to overwhelm Ukrainian air defense in a sequence designed by an AI-assisted targeting system. The CSSIS report that the European Commission cited explicitly in its own defense industry transformation roadmap found that AI-enabled autonomous navigation had transformed Ukrainian drone hit probability from between 10 and 20% under manual control to between 70 and 80% under AI-assisted guidance. That improvement from roughly 1 hit in 7 attempts to roughly 4 in 5 is not an incremental operational advantage. It changes the fundamental math of aerial attrition in a way that every European defense planner was watching in real time. The European Defence Fund, the EU's primary vehicle for collaborative defense research since 2021, was designed for a different world. Its processes were built for the scale and deliberateness of major capability development programs, next-generation fighter jets, satellite systems, submarine platforms, the kind of investments that appropriately require years of design validation before any budget is committed. It was not built to respond to a battlefield dynamic where a startup operating out of a converted warehouse in Lviv can produce a drone system that outperforms a program that took years to develop and billions of euros to fund. The European Defence Fund, the EU's primary vehicle for collaborative defence research since 2021, was designed for a different world. Its processes were built for the scale and deliberateness of major capability development programs, next-generation fighter jets, satellite systems, submarine platforms, the kind of investments that appropriately require years of design validation before any budget is committed. It was not built to respond to a battlefield dynamic where a startup operating out of a converted warehouse in Lviv can produce a drone system that outperforms a program that took years to develop and billions of euros to fund. The structural problem is not unique to the EU, but the EU's version of it is more deeply embedded than most. National defense agencies and individual member states have procurement cycles measured in years or decades. The EU layer on top of those national processes adds committee reviews, cross-border consortium requirements, language translation of technical specifications across multiple official languages, and legal harmonization checks against the procurement laws of every member state. Involved? A program that moves from concept to contract in 3 years inside a single national defense ministry can take 6 to 8 years inside the EU's collaborative funding framework. Because every step that happens, once nationally must happen multiple times institutionally. Ukraine exposed the cost of this structure in live fire. European member states discovered that the weapon systems they donated to Ukraine required weeks to months of training for Ukrainian operators and months to years for Ukrainian repair technicians, partly because the systems were too complex, too digitally dependent, and too manufacturer-specific in their maintenance requirements. The same institutional processes that produced those systems also prevented Europe from adapting them quickly once the battlefield revealed their limitations. A drone that needs a software update to defeat a newly deployed Russian electronic warfare technique cannot wait 3 years for a procurement cycle software update. Like and subscribe, because the mismatch between the speed of modern warfare innovation and the speed of European institutional response is not a minor administrative inconvenience. It is a strategic vulnerability that adversaries understand and exploit. The Commission's own language in the agile proposal is direct in a way that EU institutional communications rarely permit. Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine has shown that success on the battlefield now depends on short innovation cycles. The ability to develop, test, and deploy new technologies and cost-efficient solutions in weeks or months rather than years. That sentence, which appears verbatim in the official Commission documentation, would have seemed dramatically overstated as a description of defense procurement requirements at almost any point before 2022. By March of 2026, it was a description of current operational reality that every NATO defense ministry accepted without serious objection. Agile is structured as what the Commission calls a pilot instrument, designed explicitly to test whether the European Union can actually operate at commercial startup speeds inside the institutional framework of an intergovernmental organization built around consensus, committee review, and multi-stage approval processes. The 20 to 30 projects it will fund receive up to 100% of eligible costs, an unusually generous coverage rate designed to remove the financial barrier that typically stops startups and small companies from pursuing defense contracts that require substantial upfront investment with uncertain and distant payment timelines. The retroactive clause is the most revealing structural detail in the entire program. Companies can claim expenses incurred up to 3 months before the application window closes. That provision exists because the Commission recognizes that in a fast-moving technology environment, promising companies cannot wait for a grant announcement before beginning development work. By the time the announcement arrives, the relevant technology window may already have passed. The retroactive clause essentially allows Agile to back technologies that the market has already identified as worth pursuing, rather than requiring companies to pause development and wait for Brussels to catch up. Now understand where quantum technology sits inside this framework, because its placement in the same category as drones and artificial intelligence is not rhetorical. It reflects a specific operational assessment about which technologies determine the outcome of conflicts at the timescale that matters. Read that again, slowly, because the EU's Defense Industry Transformation Roadmap explicitly names quantum as a key emerging technology in the same sentence as its discussion of AI, and the 2026 European Defence Fund Work Programme allocates a quarter of its €1 billion budget, specifically to future-oriented technologies, including quantum-secured networks. That quarter, €250 million of the fund's annual allocation, is directed toward technologies that European defense planners believe will define the military balance of power in the 2030s, rather than the capabilities already in the field today. The quantum applications that the EDF's 2026 program specifically targets are divided between quantum-secured communications and the sensing and navigation capabilities that the Ukraine conflict has made urgently relevant. On the communications side, the Harvest Now Decrypt Later threat that the Atlas Institute for International Affairs identified in its April 2026 analysis sits at the center of the operational concern. State actors are already collecting and storing European military communications in encrypted form, waiting for a future quantum computer capable of decrypting them retroactively. The communications that will be most damaging to read in hindsight are not necessarily the ones that seem most sensitive today. They are the ones that describe operational patterns, alliance coordination mechanisms, supply chain logistics, and command relationships, the structural information that reveals how a force actually operates rather than what it claims to be planning. The CIPRI 2025 documentation of Harvest Now Decrypt Later as a deliberate long-term intelligence strategy by state-level actors is significant precisely because it came from an independent research institution, rather than from a government with a policy interest in emphasizing the threat. CIPRI's assessment that this practice is already occurring, not as a future risk, but as a current intelligence collection methodology, meant that every encrypted European military communication transmitted during the period between now and whenever a cryptographically relevant quantum computer emerges is potentially compromised in a future that official planning now treats as arriving within the current decade. The U.S. Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency has confirmed that threat actors are targeting data today that will require protection well into the future. The European equivalents of that assessment, produced independently in French, German, and Dutch national intelligence analyses, have converged on the same timeline estimates that the U.S. Global Risk Institute's 2026 survey captured: a 28 to 49% probability of a cryptographically relevant quantum computer within 10 years. A defense organization that continues transmitting sensitive communications on classical encryption systems after reading those assessments is making an active choice about risk tolerance rather than an innocent failure to understand the situation. The EDF's Quantum Tactical Networks research responds to this threat with a specific operational requirement that most laboratory quantum communication research doesn't address directly. Any funded solution must demonstrate operability under real battlefield conditions, including jamming, degraded electromagnetic environments, and GPS denial, rather than controlled laboratory settings. That requirement is the European military establishment's way of saying it is not looking for a theoretical solution that works in a physics building. It is looking for something that can maintain its security guarantees inside an active electronic warfare environment of the kind that Russia has already demonstrated against Ukrainian forces across multiple operational theaters. But that's not even the most structurally significant aspect of how the EU has reorganized its defense innovation approach around the Ukraine conflict's lessons. For the first time in the European Defense Fund's history, Ukrainian entities are eligible to participate in EDF projects as subcontractors and third-party recipients. The Commission frames this explicitly as bringing direct battlefield experience into EU-funded research and development. That framing represents a fundamental acknowledgement that the most operationally relevant defense technology knowledge in Europe right now doesn't sit in the research labs of established prime contractors in France, Germany, or Sweden. It sits in the companies and military units that have been testing, failing, redesigning, and redeploying systems under live fire conditions for 3 years. One flagship project illustrates how seriously this integration is being taken. Stratus, an AI-powered cyber defense system for drone swarms, includes a Ukrainian subcontractor, specifically because the Commission wanted direct battlefield expertise built into the system's design from the earliest stage rather than consulted after the initial architecture had already been determined. The difference between consulting battlefield experience and embedding it in the design team is not procedural. It determines whether the resulting system reflects what warfare at machine speed actually requires, or what procurement specifications written in comfortable offices in Brussels assumed it should require. Like and subscribe, because the decision to bring Ukrainian industrial and operational knowledge directly into EU defense research programs may turn out to be as strategically significant as any specific technology the programs fund. The February 2026 LEAP initiative, announced jointly by France, Germany, Italy, Poland, and the United Kingdom, adds another layer to the same strategic logic. The Low-Cost Effectors and Autonomous Platforms Initiative aims at jointly manufacturing low-cost air defense systems and autonomous drones using Ukrainian expertise. 5 of Europe's most significant military powers coordinating specifically to acquire Ukrainian manufacturing and operational knowledge, rather than simply donating weapons to Ukraine, represents a recognition that 3 years of the most intense conventional warfare Europe has seen since 1945 has produced a body of practical defense technology knowledge that cannot be replicated in any training environment or simulation. Now consider the full architecture of the EU's defense spending transformation across 2026, because agile is the most visible element of a much larger restructuring that most coverage has addressed only in fragments. The European Defence Fund's €1 billion 2026 work program divided roughly half into major conventional capabilities and a quarter each into future technologies and defense innovation support through EUDIS, sits alongside the European Defense Industry Programme's €1.5 billion allocation for 2026 to 2027, targeting member state procurement cooperation and production capacity. The 2025 Security Action for Europe mobilized €150 billion in loans to boost member states' defense readiness. The Defense Equity Facility directs €500 million toward private investment funds backing European defense innovation companies. The EU Defense Innovation Office in Kiev, established under the European Defense Industrial Strategy in 2024, provides the institutional connection between Ukraine's operational experience and the European programs designed to incorporate it. Those figures, added together, represent a scale of European defense investment that has no precedent in the post-Cold War era. The EU has committed to spending at a level that its own officials describe as a structural transformation of the European defense industrial base, rather than a temporary increase driven by the specific circumstances of the Ukraine conflict. Now here's where the quantum dimension of this transformation connects to something that goes beyond any single defense program's budget allocation. The EU's EuroQCI initiative, the European Quantum Communication Infrastructure, is targeting a fully operational continental quantum communication network by 2030, backed by more than €1 billion in EU funding with European Space Agency involvement. The Eagle-1 satellite, Europe's first satellite-based quantum key distribution system, was planned for launch in 2026 as the space component of that infrastructure. The terrestrial fiber networks connecting European capitals through quantum channels are at various stages of development across member states. The connection between EuroQCI and the defense programs funded through EDF is not incidental. A quantum-secured communication network connecting European defense ministries, military command structures, and strategic assets would provide the backbone for a different kind of military coordination than NATO's existing communications infrastructure allows. It would be a European communications layer that is physically resistant to interception by any adversary, not through stronger encryption that might eventually be broken, but through the fundamental impossibility of copying a quantum state without disturbing it. The connection between EuroQCI and the defense programs funded through EDF is not incidental. A quantum-secured communication network connecting European defense ministries, military command structures, and strategic assets would provide the backbone for a different kind of military coordination than NATO's existing communications infrastructure allows. It would be a European communications layer that is physically resistant to interception by any adversary, not through stronger encryption that might eventually be broken, but through the fundamental impossibility of copying a quantum state without disturbing it. The distinction between those two types of security is worth dwelling on, because it determines how long the protection lasts. Classical encryption, even very strong classical encryption, is secure only until an adversary develops the computational power to break it. Post-quantum classical encryption extends that timeline significantly, but doesn't eliminate the fundamental dependency on computational hardness assumptions. Quantum key distribution security derives from a law of nature that no computational advance can change, the quantum no-cloning theorem. If European military communications are eventually transmitted through a quantum-secured channel, the communications exchanged today will be as unreadable to a future adversary with a million-qubit quantum computer as they are to an adversary with no quantum computer at all. That is not a theoretical security property. It is the reason multiple European nations are investing in EuroQCI infrastructure simultaneously, and it is the reason the EDF's 2026 work program allocated a quarter of its billion-euro budget to future technologies, including quantum-secured networks at the same time that agile was being proposed for the faster cycle innovation layer below it. Read that again slowly, because the strategic implication of a European military communication backbone that cannot be decrypted even after the fact by any quantum computer that might ever be built is not simply a security upgrade. It is a change in the fundamental risk calculus that European defense planning has operated under since the Cold War. The Atlas Institute analysis published in April of 2026 identified a specific structural risk in European quantum defense investment that the programs themselves have not yet fully addressed. Two distinct technical approaches to quantum secure communications are currently being pursued in parallel across Europe: post-quantum cryptography, which replaces mathematically vulnerable algorithms through software updates, and quantum key distribution, which uses the laws of physics to make interception physically detectable. The risk is interoperability. If different European member states or European and allied systems end up implementing different approaches on incompatible technical architectures, the resulting patchwork of quantum security measures would have gaps at every interface point where the two approaches attempt to communicate with each other. That interoperability problem is one the Agile program doesn't directly address, because Agile is structured to fund individual innovative companies developing specific products, rather than the standards setting and protocol harmonization work needed to ensure those products eventually communicate reliably with each other across national borders. The EDF's Quantum Tactical Networks research is more explicitly targeted at operational interoperability, but the European Defence Establishment has not yet produced the equivalent of a NATO STANIG, a standardization agreement for quantum military communications. But that's not even the most commercially and industrially significant dimension of what the EU launched in March of 2026. Agile's specific focus on startups and small and medium-sized enterprises is not an incidental programmatic choice. It reflects a documented structural analysis of where European defense innovation is currently happening and where it is failing to reach deployment. The Commission's own data shows that more than 200 defense-focused startups have emerged across Europe in recent years, backed by record levels of private investment, many operating in dual-use technology areas where the distinction between civilian and defense applications is often less a matter of physics than of marketing. These companies move at speeds and with iterative approaches that the EU's existing defense prime contractors, the Airbus Defence and Space Operations, the Thales Groups, the Leonardo Enterprises, are structurally ill-suited to match. A large established contractor building a quantum communication system for a government customer operates under procurement rules, liability frameworks, and design review requirements that add years and hundreds of millions of euros to programs that a focused startup could potentially prototype in months. Agile's explicit targeting of startups is an attempt to build a parallel track to the established industrial base rather than route innovation through existing contractors who would inevitably shape that innovation to fit their own institutional processes. The 4-month decision timeline is where this ambition will actually be tested, because 4 months from initial application to funding decision would be genuinely unprecedented for an EU program. The EU's own procurement processes for traditional contracts have historical averages measured in years rather than months. The political consensus requirements of an intergovernmental body create structural friction that a national government can simply override by ministerial decision. Whether Agile can actually deliver 4-month decisions while maintaining the legal and financial accountability requirements that EU funds are subject to is a question that cannot be answered by reading the proposal. It can only be answered by watching whether the first round of Agile grants is actually paid within the promised timeframe. Like and subscribe, because the gap between an EU announcement about speed and an EU program that actually operates at speed is one that European defense watchers have learned to maintain healthy skepticism about. Now consider the broader geopolitical context that makes the timing of all of this significant beyond the specific technologies being funded. The Euronews coverage that accompanied the Agile announcement noted that the Iran-US conflict had become the ultimate testbed for next-generation military technology in the same way that Ukraine had been for the preceding period. Iranian drone swarms at Kuwait International Airport. American AI focused targeting systems updated continuously during operations. The conflict demonstrated, in a theater completely different from Eastern Europe, that the same technological dynamics observed in Ukraine were not a local adaptation to specific terrain or specific adversaries. They were the general condition of modern warfare between adversaries who have access to current technology and the industrial capacity to deploy it rapidly. The Euronews coverage that accompanied the Agile announcement noted that the Iran-US conflict had become the ultimate testbed for next-generation military technology in the same way that Ukraine had been for the preceding period. Iranian drone swarms at Kuwait International Airport. American AI-focused targeting systems updated continuously during operations. The conflict demonstrated, in a theater completely different from Eastern Europe, that the same technological dynamics observed in Ukraine were not a local adaptation to specific terrain or specific adversaries. They were the general condition of modern warfare between adversaries who have access to current technology and the industrial capacity to deploy it rapidly. The Iran conflict's specific contributions to European defense analysis are worth examining separately from Ukraine's because the two conflicts produced complementary lessons rather than identical ones. Ukraine primarily demonstrated the importance of volume, adaptability, and electronic warfare at the tactical level. Large numbers of cheap, rapidly iterated unmanned systems overwhelmed defenses designed for a world of scarce, expensive precision weapons. Electronic warfare became a constant environmental condition rather than an edge capability deployed in specific scenarios. The adaptation cycle between a new drone design and the countermeasure to that drone design compressed to days or weeks. The Iran-US conflict demonstrated something different: the reach and lethality of coordinated drone swarms operating as a force multiplier for conventional ballistic and cruise missile salvos. Iranian systems operating in large numbers forced adversary air defense to allocate interceptors at exchange rates that favored the attacker economically. Even when the individual drone's destructive capacity was modest, American Project Maven's AI-assisted targeting showed how real-time data fusion across multiple intelligence sources could compress targeting cycle times from hours to minutes. The combination of those two lessons produced a battlefield picture in which the side with better AI, faster adaptation, and more resilient communications had structural advantages that could not be overcome simply by having better individual weapons. For European defense planners, watching both conflicts simultaneously, the message was unambiguous. The era in which military technology advantage could be sustained through the development of a small number of highly sophisticated, extremely expensive platforms deployed in limited numbers was ending. The emerging paradigm was one where advantage derived from speed of adaptation, volume of autonomous systems, quality of AI-assisted decision support, and the security of communications across a network that could function even when parts of it were disrupted or jammed. Quantum technology contributes to two of those four requirements directly. Quantum-secured communications provide network security that degrades gracefully, rather than catastrophically when portions of it are attacked. Quantum sensing provides navigation and timing that functions independently of GPS in exactly the electronic warfare environments that both Russia and Ukraine and Iran and the Gulf have demonstrated they can impose on adversaries. The EU placed quantum next to drones and AI and agile not because bureaucrats in Brussels decided it sounded technologically impressive. They placed it there because the military analysis feeding into European defense planning identified quantum sensing and quantum secured communications as operational requirements that the conflicts of 2022 through 2026 had elevated from long-term strategic investments to near-term operational gaps. The gap between knowing a capability is needed and having it deployed with units in the field is exactly what Agile's 1 to 3 year deployment timeline was designed to close. Whether it can actually close that gap for quantum technologies, whose engineering challenges are considerably more demanding than the drone and AI applications that share the Agile category, will depend on answers that the first round of funded companies must provide through demonstrated results rather than promising proposals. Quantum systems cannot be iterated at the same speed as a software-defined drone's flight controller. The physics of maintaining quantum coherence in a field environment imposes constraints that a better software update cannot overcome. The operational testing requirements for a system intended to provide tamper-proof timing or intercept-proof communications to active military units are considerably more stringent than the operational testing requirements for a new drone airframe. But that doesn't mean the inclusion of quantum and agile is purely aspirational. The British flight tests of quantum inertial navigation in real aircraft in May of 2024 demonstrated that quantum sensing technology is at a stage where field performance can be evaluated. CSIRO's delivery of field-ready quantum timing hardware to the Australian Defence Force in July of 2026 demonstrated that portable quantum systems suitable for operational deployment are achievable with current engineering. The question for Agile's quantum component is not whether quantum defense technologies can ever reach this stage, but whether European companies can reach it on the 1 to 3 year timeline the program specifies. The answer is that some applications are ready now and others are years away. And Agile's competitive selection process will determine which companies are close enough to operational deployment to be worth the investment. The program's 4-month decision cycle is designed precisely to allow the Commission to make those judgments quickly enough to matter, before the companies with promising technologies either run out of funding or get acquired by non-European entities. Read that again, slowly, because the acquisition risk is not hypothetical. Multiple European quantum startups with defense-relevant technology have been approached by or acquired by American and other non-European investors. In the period since 2022, when defense technology, investment in quantum systems accelerated globally. Maintaining European sovereign capability in quantum defense technology is partly a question of funding development programs. It is equally a question of ensuring that the companies developing that capability remain European-owned at the point where their technology becomes operationally significant. Agile is 115 million euros. It is a pilot program. In the context of the full European defense investment landscape, including the EDF's billion-euro annual work program, EUDIS, EDIP, SAFE, and the Defense Equity Facility, it is a relatively small amount, targeted at a specific, structurally important gap in how European defense innovation currently reaches operational deployment. Its significance is not in its absolute size, but in what it represents institutionally. It is the EU's first serious attempt to build a defense innovation instrument that operates at commercial technology speed, rather than at the speed of government procurement timelines, and it placed quantum technology on its list of priorities alongside drones, and artificial intelligence not as a gesture toward future technology, but as a recognition that the battlefield use cases for quantum sensing and quantum secured communications are close enough to operational reality to belong on the same urgent list, as systems already being iterated in active conflict zones. History offers a useful check on both excessive optimism and excessive skepticism about programs like this one. DARPA, the American Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, built its reputation over 6 decades on funding high-risk, high-reward research at speeds that regular defense procurement couldn't match, and on tolerating failures that regular procurement couldn't politically afford. Its successes include the foundational research that became the Internet, GPS, stealth technology, and much of the core architecture of modern autonomous systems. But DARPA's model works because it has decades of institutional culture supporting it, a talent pool trained to operate within its unusual norms, and a congressional appropriation structure that has been adapted over decades to its specific requirements. Agile is being built from scratch inside an institution that has none of those foundations yet. Whether the EU can actually operate a defense innovation program at commercial speed remains genuinely uncertain, in a way that no amount of well-crafted Commission documentation can resolve. The 4-month decision timeline will be tested by the first call for applications. The 1 to 3 year deployment target will be tested by the first funded projects. The institutional culture, capable of tolerating the failures that fast-moving innovation programs necessarily produce, will be tested by the first high-profile project that doesn't work. Each of those tests will reveal something that the program's proposal documents cannot. The EU built a program designed to move at the speed of war. Quantum got placed on the priority list because war is now moving at the speed of technology. And quantum technology is the layer underneath every other capability that determines whether the communications infrastructure survives, whether the navigation functions under jamming, and whether the encrypted communications of today can be read by adversaries tomorrow. 3 separate conflicts across 3 separate theaters in the first half of the 2020s delivered the same message simultaneously. Europe finally appears to be listening. Whether it can act fast enough is the question that the next 3 years will answer.